I'm just going to go ahead and clear out what we have from the previous chapter and just delete our nodes so that we're working with an entirely blank function, an entirely blank terrain. Now that we have a little bit better understanding of most of the different connectors we can use to control our terrains, we're going to take a look at the combiner nodes and start putting together some of our different fractals and noise nodes and use them with math nodes and turbulence to create some pretty neat looking terrains. I'm going to start out by clicking on our altitude output node, and then we're going to go up to our add fractal node. And now we can see that this has automatically gone to our open ocean since it was the last one we were using. I'm going to change this to a simple fractal. And then we can also see time. We have an extra. So we can go ahead and delete that input node because we do not need it. So I'm going to adjust our scale. I'm also going to reposition the function editor. I'm going to increase our scale so we can see this at about half, which means I also want to adjust our wavelength to 0.5. And before I was talking about using noise nodes to control the overall shape of a terrain, and then using fractal nodes to add upon that. And we can do that by using combiner nodes. So let's start out by doing that. I'm going to delete our connection between our fractal right now, go into altitude, select it, and add a noise node. Now we're going to use this noise node to basically just define the overall shape of our terrain. And I'm just going to stick with the cellular patterns Voronoi. And this way we get those humps that we want, if that's what you're looking for. But right now we really don't have any detail. So what we need to do is combine the detail of our fractal node along with the noise node, which is defining our overall shape. Now we can use any one of these different noise nodes to define our current shape, but I'm going to stick with the Voronoi right now. I'm going to select our connecting line and the link between our noise node and our altitude, and I'm going to select our combiner node. Click Add Combiner. I'm going to just reposition these so we can see them just a little bit better. And now, for combiner nodes, we have several different options. We have a blender, the combiner, a color combiner, add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Now, some of these are not going to be very useful for terrains. Color combiner, for one thing, would not be something that we would really need while working on the altitude. If we were working on the material for our terrain, that, of course, would be extremely helpful. Let's take a look right now with our blender, which is one of the ones that I use the most, just because we can control our ratio between our two different nodes by extracting a parameter and connecting it to something else. But if we take a look at the blender right now, we can see we have an extra arrow on top. This allows us to connect our combiner to another node. So I'm just going to connect this to our simple fractal. And we can see that we have a very even blend between our noise node, which is creating the initial shape, and our fractal node, which is just adding that bit of extra details to the top of it. And I'm just going to go ahead and make this function output just a little bit larger, so we can see that just a little bit better. And now if we go back to our blender, we can see we have a couple of different options. Combination mode is currently set to blend. We could also change this to add, which will add to the existing surface. We could do max, which is going to set the maximum amount, and you can see that we really only have that fractal showing up in the lowest areas of our noise node. We have minimum, which is basically going to do the exact opposite, where we have our fractal taking up the majority of the scene, and then in certain areas we can start to see the noise node, but overall that's not really working out. We can take a look at the subtract mode, and what that's going to do is take away from our surface and subtract the detail, going more inward rather than adding to it. And then our last is multiply, which will blend them together very evenly. And these work similarly to a lot of the filters available in programs like Photoshop and other image editing programs that have these different combination modes. But if we take a look, we also have a ratio. What this allows us to do is adjust which surface we'd like to see more. So if I bring this over to the left, we'll see more of our noise node. If I drag it over to the right, to a higher number, we see more of our fractal node. And since we're in multiply right now, it's still combining both of the surfaces together, and we can see both areas from each of the surfaces, and we can see more of the Voronoi in these certain areas, and that's basically because that's more of a black part of our simple fractal, so they're still showing through. Let's change that to blend, and now we can see it overwriting a little bit more. So now we can adjust. If we go to our left, we'll really see the noise node. Move through, we start to see it blending a little bit more. And with blend mode on, basically what we're doing is overlaying them directly and then adjusting the opacity value as we adjust the ratio. So if we move all the way to 1, we're going to see basically our right surface, which is our simple fractal. If we go all the way to the left, which is going to be a value of 0, we're going to see our noise node. If this was on multiply, we would still see some of them together. Of course, in this case, since the Voronoi noise node takes up a lot of different area and a lot of space at the higher elevations, we don't see that as much. But if we move this all the way to 1, where we're seeing parts of the fractal now, we can still see the Voronoi showing through. So we can use a lot of these different combination modes to really get exactly what we're looking for. And if you want an even variation, the default is 0.5. And now we can see just a little bit of each of our surfaces. But this is a great way to define a shape based on a noise node if you want to pick out the kind of shape that you want first, and then add a specific detail onto it later by using a fractal node. Now if we go into our noise node, we could change this to something else. I'm going to go to a math pattern, and we'll select triangular. And now we can see that shape of that noise node showing up to create sort of pyramids. And then we have it blending together with our fractal. So we could change this to sawteeth. And now we see the overall shapes of our noise node. But we also get the nice detail that we have from our fractal node combined with that. We can change that to onion. And we can see the same sort of an effect. And then depending on how we adjust the ratio in our blender and our combiner node, we start to get different results. So it's a really neat way to sort of pick out specific shapes. We'll go to line patterns, we'll select cracks, and now we can see all those cracks showing up, but instead of it being a flat surface on top, which it would normally be, we have a nice blend with our fractal. And we can see that very easily just by deleting our link between our blender and our fractal, and now we can see just specifically that noise node. So we can change this to something else. We could take a look at fabric, and now we see those fabric shapes showing up. And we'll go back to our blender, reconnect that to our fractal, and now we can see we no longer have a smooth surface, we have a nice roughness. So we could do anything we want to this fractal. We could add some turbulence to it and make it a little more varied. And then we'd see that show up on our noise node so that we can define our initial shape but have some really neat details along with it. And let's just take a look at some of our other combiner options. Underneath Blender, we have Combiner. We'll go ahead and reconnect that. It works very similarly, except that we have our ratios defined a little bit differently. Before we had one constant number defining the distances and the opacity values of between each of our surfaces. But with the combiner, we still get our combination modes, plus a couple of extras. We can do variable roughness, blend, max and min, and multiply. If we change that to variable roughness, we can see a little bit of a different effect. But now we have our input 1 and input 2. And basically what these are, our first input is our fabric, and our second input is our simple fractal. So we can adjust the amplitude of our surface. And now we can see we're seeing a lot more of our noise node, decrease our amplitude. Now we're seeing more of our simple fractal. We can adjust the offset. And we can see that basically lowering our overall brightness, which lets our other input show up a little bit better. So we can adjust each of those settings and raise that up. Input 2 works the same way. Now we're controlling our fractal. We can make that amplitude a lot higher, adjust our offset, make it a little bit brighter, or at least make our image itself brighter, which reflects onto our altitude as higher amounts and more smoothing. But one of the nice things about the combiner is we're not just limited to 2 different surfaces. You can see we now have another arrow, which means I could combine this with another node. So let's add another fractal. I'm going to stick with the simple, change our cellular patterns to Voronoi. And we're going to select our combiner and that last connector we have and connect to our simple fractal. If we go and click on our combiner now, we can see we have an input 3. This is now our new simple fractal, which is the Voronoi. So we can adjust our amplitude of that specific material and our third input, and also adjust its offset. So now we can start to see that third material show up. Well, if we also take a look at the combiner once again, we can see we have another arrow, which means we can add another node. So I'm going to go ahead and click in here in a blank area. We're going to add another fractal. And this time I'm going to select something that's really going to show up. And we'll do our onion. We can go to our combiner. And we can see that new arrow pop up. Select it, connect it to our simple fractal. And now, if we click on our combiner, we can see an input 4. So now we have another surface we can blend together very easily, where we can adjust the amplitude and the offset. And if you notice, we also have another arrow. So we can keep adding, and every time we add a new surface, we'll add a new input, which will give us the ability to change its amplitude and offset in relation to our other inputs. And we can basically just keep adding those on top of each other and blend them together to get some really neat looking surfaces. And that way we have a lot of control over our objects. And I'm just going to frame this really quick so we can see more of our object. Let's go ahead and add another noise node in really quick. And we'll select something a little bit different. And we'll do dots. And then we'll go to our combiner, select that last arrow, and we want to connect that. If we go back to our combiner, we can now see an input 5, which is our dots. So if we can increase the amplitude, and now we see the majority of that showing up. Or we can see our dots in different areas. But once we get to the higher values, it starts to overwrite some of our other values. Go ahead and frame that. Just zoom out, actually, since we have our output observer taking up the majority of the space. And we'll just set our zoom and frame that. So that's a very, very useful option that we have. We can also change our combination modes, like I was saying before. We have variable roughness, ABS, ABS. And we can see that changes dramatically the way that everything is blended together. But we could also set that to either add or blend. We could do min, max. We could also do multiply, and that way we really don't lose any detail from any of our different nodes. And all of them are somewhat involved. We can see right now the more dominant one is really the onion. But let's just take a look at some of our other options. We're going to change this from a combiner. If we go to color combiner, this will give us the ability to connect colors. Now you can also see that this is a green line that we have, which will not allow us to connect to any of these unless we have color nodes set up. Since we don't have any color nodes and working with terrains has really nothing to do with color, we currently cannot use this for editing terrains. So we can move on. We have an add option, so I can select specifically which one I want, add, subtract, multiply, or divide, rather than using the blender or the combiner and setting an option. So I'm going to change this just to multiply, and we can select our fabric, and then we can also select our third node that we had created, and now that's multiplying those together. When we get a new option, we can go ahead and connect our dots, and we can start to see those show up. But one of the drawbacks to using just a specific combiner like multiply, add, subtract, or divide is that we don't have any control specifically over each of our objects. Although there are other ways to actually define those areas. I'm just going to move that up and give us a little bit of room in here. And I'm going to delete the nodes we're not using right now. And what we can actually do is just connect and select our links and our connecting lines between our combiner and each of our nodes. And we could add filters. And this will allow us to customize a little bit better how much we are using. So in this case, I can just use a standard filter. And if I reduce that from the right and bring it down, it's the same as if we were adjusting the amplitude in the previous node. So now we can see that's not showing up as much as it was. We can also adjust the filter just overall as we would normally to add key points and adjust this surface. And we can see that show up where now we have dips and divots in certain areas. I'm just going to go ahead and click OK for that. So we can adjust and put these filters in between our combiners, so that way we can adjust our fractals a little bit easier. We could also add filters after. So if I wanted to have specific filters defining each one of our nodes, but after our combiner, I could just click in here in our link between our combiner and our altitude and create a universal filter that will affect everything after all the connections have been made. And we can see that showing up. And it's actually replicating and creating the exact same filter that I had before because it's the last one that I had created. We could also change this to any of the other available filters. So I can use a sine wave. You can see that showing up. We could use an absolute wave. And it just gives us a nice combination between everything, and also a lot of extra options, just being able to add those filters in there and go beyond the initial editing. If we go back into our combiner, we're going to change this to a blender. And you can see this automatically connected our ratio to dots. And I currently do not want to use that, so I'm just going to delete that. We're going to connect our blender to our simple fractal for the second input. And we're going to take a look at one of the reasons why I like to use the blender, most of all. I'm going to change out this fabric and noise node that we have and convert that just to a fractal. And now we can see the two are being blended together. But overall, we don't really see a lot of that effect. So I'm going to change this to something we can use. Let's use Perlin Noise's gradient. And then under our simple fractal, I'm going to use something that renders a little bit faster. We're going to use chipped. You can see that showing up. Click on our blender. It's currently set to blend. Our simple fractal, which is currently showing up as just a gray amount, and that's because our wavelength is too large for our gradient. So we're going to reduce this to 0.5. And now we can see the definition caused by that specific fractal. I'm going to delete the connection between our blender and our simple fractal with the chipped pattern on, just so that we can see what our Perlin noise gradient looks like. Because it's always a good idea to separate your surfaces and look at them before you blend them, and that's basically just so you know what it is you're looking at. What I'm going to do is just take this one and increase the roughness. And the reason I'm doing this is so that we can really see the differences between our surfaces once I start changing the way we are combining them together. So we'll take our connection and I'm going to switch them, and we can take a look at our other fractal node. I'm going to select that fractal and decrease our roughness so it's just a little bit smoother. So now we have one very rough surface and one slightly smoother surface, where we still have a lot of definition in there, but overall it's fairly smooth. And this will be a lot easier for us to tell exactly which objects or which fractals are showing through. So I'm going to take this line, and instead of just connecting our second one to our first fractal, I want to make sure that that first fractal is our first input. So I'm just going to move that over, select our second line, and connect it to our secondary fractal. And now we have the two just blending together with the default value. But let's take a look at using another node to actually control the ratio, and that way we can get some really neat effects that way. So I'm going to click Extract Parameter next to our ratio. This is going to give us a constant node, which really isn't going to give us any change. So what we want to do is change this constant to a fractal node. And now we can see that rendering out. And now one of the disadvantages of using a fractal for this method is that we're not going to get very smooth lines between certain things with our roughness set higher. I'm going to decrease our roughness. And I also want to change the pattern that we're using to work with this. So I'm going to change this to Perlin Noise's value gradient. We'll just let that refresh. And I'm going to adjust our size because our wavelength is a little too large. And we can tell just by looking at the actual preview. So I'm going to change this to 0.2 on all of our axes, just to start with. And that'll give us a little more variation between our objects. But it's still very difficult to tell exactly which surfaces are showing through where. And the main reason for that is that we have such a loose gradient. If we take a look, a lot of blending. It's a very smooth surface. So what I'm going to do is increase our roughness just a little bit to define some of those areas. But one of the major things I want to do is give us a higher contrast. So I'm going to increase our gain. And once we increase our gain, we can start to see those values showing through a little bit easier. We can see our smoother surface, which is our second input. And then if we take a look at all the rough areas, we can tell that that is from our first input. So we can easily break apart the differences between these objects by using either a noise node or a fractal node to control the ratio in which these are blended. And now as I adjust our size, we'll see that a little bit better. I'm going to bring this down to 0.1 on each of our axes. And we'll see a lot more variation between our two different nodes. So we can really see now the overall blending between our two surfaces, where we have the roughness caused by our high roughness level on our first input, which is our simple fractal with a Perlin noise gradient. And if we take a look, our smoother areas are from our lower roughness value of our chipped. So if I reduce our roughness even more, we're going to end up with a very smooth surface. And now we can see that showing up a lot better for those areas that are showing through. Now, not only can we control the ratio and get some nice effects, but we also, right now we're currently in the blend mode. Now the blend mode is going to give us one or the other when we're controlling with our node. So right now in these areas, we're either getting one surface or the other, and there's really no blending between, except in our lower gradient areas where we have sort of a blend. And then we can see those sort of blending together. But other than that, it's going to be one surface or the other. So we can actually change our combination mode if we want. Change that to add. And now we're going to add the surfaces together. But of course, then we lose those specific values where we know we have some smooth areas. But it really depends on what it is you're working on. Change that to multiply, and then we have an even blend between the two, which will actually end up smoothing out almost everything. And we can see that showing up. And overall, it looks pretty good. But the only real drawback to this is that we can only really control two nodes at once. And the reason for that is, if we take a look at our control, it's white and black. So one of these is representing white, and the other input is representing black. But we can still get around that quite easily, actually, just by creating another combiner underneath the current combiner. Or we could also do is separate these surfaces by combining them as well. Let's go ahead and do that first. I'm going to change this from multiply back to blend, so we're getting either one surface or the other. And I'm going to edit our smooth surface, which is our second input and our chipped surface. And I'm just going to move some of these nodes out of the way so we have a little bit of room to work. Move up our output nodes on the top, or actually those would be our input nodes, and just move our fractal up. And now we're going to select our link between our simple fractal, this more smoothed one, and our blender, and just select that line and add another combiner. We also want to keep this on our blender. And right now we're not going to see any options because we're not really blending it together with anything. Of course, because we're not blending together with anything, we also see a much lighter color, which will affect our surface. So I can create something that will really show up. I'm going to create a very defined new fractal node. So I'm going to click and make one of these invisible red boxes. Click in an invisible area. Add a new fractal node, which is going to create the exact same fractal of the last one selected. And I'm going to change this to something a little more obvious. And we'll select our onion this time. And what we can also do is, if we want to see what that onion is going to look like, is we can disconnect our altitude to our current blender, just connect that onion, and now we can see that showing up. Of course, that might be something that's a little too large to really see it blending together. So let's pick something else. Let's take a look at crystals. And we should be able to see those crystals fairly well. So I'm going to increase our roughness. But I also want to increase our scale, or actually decrease our wavelength, so that we can see much more variation. And I'm going to bring these down to 0.2 on all of our axes. And now that's definitely a surface that's going to be showing up when we mix it together. So I'm going to delete this input and this link that we have, reconnect our altitude to our blender. So now we're back to the same surface that we had before. And I want to connect our new blender, select our second input, and put it into our new fractal. Now, because our ratio is a constant number, we're not really going to get to see those smooth areas anymore, or correct a blend. So what we want to do is create a new node for blending those two together. Now what we could do is actually use the same node that we were using before. The only problem with that is that it's really going to leave a lot of areas open. I could easily just connect our ratio directly to this simple fractal, and we probably would see a little bit of an area. Let's take a look. We can see some of the areas where it is showing up, but overall, since we are using the exact same fractal, it is cutting out the exact same areas as the other surface. So really, we're not going to see as dramatic of an effect. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete that link, and we're going to create a new fractal node to define that ratio. So we'll click in here again, create another red box, add a fractal, which is going to be the same one as the other. I'm going to use something a little bit different this time. Cellular patterns, we'll use the Voronoi. And we're going to need to make some changes to this because we really don't have that much area for our ratio. It's going to be largely our first input rather than our second. So I'm going to decrease our largest feature. And now this keeps updating, but actually it's going to look the same every time just because this is not connected. But one thing I do want to do is just take a look at what we're working on right now. So I'm going to disconnect our second blender to our first blender and disconnect the altitude, and then reconnect this to the second blender. And this way we're just focusing on the surface that we're working on right now. I'm going to connect our ratio to our new fractal, and we can take a look at that. And now we can really see that showing up, but of course, because of the size of our wavelength, it's creating a lot of little bumps. We want something a little more varied. So I'm going to increase this to 0.5 on all of our axes, just keeping it uniform. Although you could easily stretch them one way or the other. But basically what we're noticing is there's a lot of white areas, and that's going to cause a very uneven blend. If we take a look at our gain, we can see once we decrease that, we have even more of a blend between the two, and much more variation. If we really increase that gain, then we end up with still very small black areas. And what we actually need to do is sort of increase that spacing. I'm going to go to the Edit. We're going to select Smooth Rounded. We can see that sort of increases our area as this is updating, but overall, not a whole lot. And that might be because of this type of node as well. And we could switch between these different options. Our neighbor mode. I'm going to decrease our gain, change that back to rounded, and actually maybe we'll go back to smooth, just so we have that nice harsh edge. And we're just going to pick something that has a nice blend between the two different colors. And it looks like second closest neighbor should work out quite well. So I'm going to click OK. And now we can take a look, and we can see a very nice blend between these two surfaces. We can really see those patterns showing up from our ratio distribution of using this specific node. If I increase our gain, then we can select whether or not we'd like to see blending between the two or just one surface or the other. And now we can see we still have our smoother areas along with our rough areas from our new surface. So that's pretty cool looking. And now let's go ahead and just connect them all together, and we can see what they look like. So I'm going to disconnect our altitude to our blender, reconnect the one blender to the second blender, or our combiner, select our altitude to our first combiner that we created, and we'll let this refresh. And now we can see we have a very nice blend between all of these different surfaces. And we can start to see those new areas that we created by blending those two new surfaces together. But basically what we've done by adding a blender before our first blender is we're still within our certain areas. So basically, let's just say we're input 2 would be our blender to these areas, and input 2 would be the black section. So these two are being blended entirely within the black area, and our white area is entirely input 1. So what I could do is do the exact same thing, add another blender to here, and combine these surfaces. So we could have two more fractals to separate our white area of our defined ratio, or I can blend the entire function that I just created along with another set of options. So they would be overwriting each other. So instead of staying within either one color or the other, they would be overlaying each other. And the easiest way to do that is just to go underneath the first blender that I had created and add another blender. And then within that, we can connect some more nodes.